So to kick us off, we have Rebecca Fielding. Rebecca has been working in the early career, early talent sector for, can I say over 20 years, Rebecca? I'm going to say over 20 years. Yeah, it's fine. Rebecca is a fellow of the Institute of the Student Employers, a fellow of the RSA, and when, as we heard sort of early on in Mike's introduction, founded Gradconsult over 10 years ago, is in fact Mike's fabulous boss. She has been supporting, pushing and sort of challenging us to all think differently about the employability sort of agenda since then with her fabulous team. So I'm really looking forward to this session. We talk a lot in education about transitioning students into education and through that kind of educational journey, as Mark was sort of alluding to earlier, but we often don't shine as much of a light on the sort of transition from education to employment, and at least not in as much detail. So really looking forward to this session from Rebecca. As with before, please do pop any questions in the Q&A, and if we have time at the end, we'll try and pick a few up with Rebecca. If not, we'll pick them up afterwards. But with that, I will hand it over to Rebecca. Take us away, Rebecca.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Claire. First of all, thank you very much for joining me. I'm sure that everybody here who's ever spoken at a conference will now be thinking, I don't envy you, Rebecca, following that amazing first session. And yes, I shall be having words with Mike later to discuss the running order of today's conference. But nonetheless, I shall do my very best to make this session as interesting and thought-provoking as Mark's was. It might not perhaps reach Zelda levels of alternative realities. What I do want to do, though, like we are doing throughout today, is bring some thinking from different parts of the sector, primarily here from the kind of graduate development sphere, particularly in terms of some of the work that we've been doing with a number of tech, startup and scale-up businesses across the sector and industry who are recruiting interns and graduates into a variety of different global roles. So looking at some of the things that we're observing there, some of the things that we're connecting and joining up between the experience we're seeing around employability and exit from institutions and that gap and that move into employment. And I'm drawing here on a number of kind of different research sources, also my 20+ years experience, as Claire has said, from working with graduates and some of the current themes that we're seeing across the landscape to explore this today. There will be a model, you will get the recording, and indeed we can provide copies of anything that you might need from the sessions today. So let's have a look at this transition then. The first thing I kind of wanted to highlight was we've talked about the rough seas of the transition from education to employment. Actually, for some people, it's a relatively straightforward next step. They're ready for it. They might perhaps have already done a placement year. They're going back to somewhere that they know, in a role that they know, with people that they know, in a location that they know, and they're ready for it. They're eager for it. And it's a reasonably straightforward next step from education to employment. I would say, however, for the vast majority of us, if we all think back to our own experiences after leaving university, and starting in our first graduate job, and perhaps even those first few early years in our career, that process of really transitioning out of the world of education and into the world of employment can be a much bigger roller coaster. It can be hard, it can be complex, it can be difficult to navigate. And so I wanted to recognise, first of all, that as always, we're talking in generalisations. I'm not talking about all students. Indeed, mature students, of course, will have much greater understanding often of the world of work and what's required in an employment landscape than students perhaps who haven't had the benefit of that life experience. So please do step into that with me, if you like, as a thought experiment as part of the lab today, and acknowledge that we're talking here in generalizations. Of course, there are always exceptions, and of course this transition is more difficult for some and easier for others. And we recognize that, you know, there are lots of often barriers around things like social mobility, equity, etc., that we're exploring later today that can play into that. So for those for whom it is a slightly more rough sea, more of a roller coaster, what might be going on? I wanted to start actually with some of those very practical things that are happening in the life shifts that between leaving university and starting my first graduate job, because it's easy, I think, for many of us to forget and perhaps, you know, even minimize what's happening for many graduates at that stage in their life. There may very well be changes in their relationship status if they had partners at universities, and indeed for those people who've been out and proud and living their best LGBTQ life at university. We hear more and more about students who feel that they actually have to go back into the closet when they start a new job for fear of or uncertainty about the environment that they might be in. It can be practical and life changes, like changes to your appearance. So suddenly, you know, I might have had lots of tattoos, blue hair, piercings, all this incredible stuff. I now need to appear and present myself in a different way. That can take some getting used to for some students. I'm also going to lose all of those amazing sports and social clubs, activities, all the things that I've got available to me, teams, societies, choirs, all this stuff that's around and available with people who've got similar and shared interests to me. If I move away from university, I might not have access to any of those things. If I'm going to work in an organisation where I'm a graduate, perhaps one of the few young people in that organisation, I'm not going to have any of those things. So finding those, particularly if I'm moving to bottom left, a new location or a new city, that's huge. If I'm moving to a new city or new location, there's obviously then lots and lots of changes around kind of the familial and social network that I've got around me, as well as just the practical implications of finding somewhere and relocating. Mental health support is a big thing. So one of the things about these key transitions in life that we know is that any key transition point in life you're more vulnerable in terms of your mental health, because there's so much changing and so much happening at any key point in time. Now, as institutions, as universities, we're also taking this particularly vulnerable moment in time to withdraw what has been exemplary, often mental health support away from our graduates and students. And so at a point when they may very well feel they're needing that, that's being withdrawn from them. So career support might very well continue for 3 years. Mental health support often stops when you graduate. And increasingly, I think careers teams are seeing that connectivity between the two, that those students who are out of work for longer are becoming less well. And of course, the Student Minds research has shown and proven that link, albeit on a small scale, that link between applying for jobs, a lack of success, and then becoming less and less mentally well. There's also significant life changes to the amount of free time I have, my work schedule. Instead of knowing what my lectures look like and being able to plan my own life around that, I'm now often working fixed hours on fixed days, or might have shifts, which means I've also got all kinds of new obligations on my time, which might include commuting as well as working. And I'm going to have a lot less free time to do all of those things I've done previously. And all of those amazing holidays. Gosh, can you all remember starting our first job and coming to the horrible realization you're going to be getting up at 6:30 every single day, and you've only got 20 days holiday a year? It's a horrifying realization, isn't it? Having spent 3 weeks at home every Christmas for most of your life, to realize you might now only have to have 3, 4 or 5 days to be at home for Christmas, and you're traveling perhaps on New Year's Eve. So, you know, these are big changes in life and lifestyle for students that, again, we can underestimate. And with all of this stuff, I think there are huge financial changes and life changes. Yes, they're earning money. If they've got a job, fantastic. But with that, they might be needing 3 months worth of deposit for a new house if they're relocating somewhere. They've got new tax and student loan obligations to understand for the first time, potentially. Again, without a lot of that support and advice that they would traditionally have got from institutions. So all of these things are going on in terms of those life shifts, often for people as they transition out of university and into employment. And it's easy, isn't it, for those of us who are 20 years into our career or more, or even 10 years in, to get a bit long in the tooth and a bit cynical about this stuff and say, yes, welcome to the real world. This is just life. You've actually had it really easy for the last few years. And, you know, those people who went into work earlier have already learned this stuff. And yet, you know, you're not going to have access to mental health support. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we all could, in the way that we should through the NHS, on an as need at point in time basis? But we don't. It's the students who live in an experience in a world which is how we would want things to be from a student experience perspective, but isn't replicated in the real world. So I think it's easy for us to minimize those things, forget those things, and think about the fact that this is just part of growing up. It's part of life, and you're going to get used to it. I think there's all kinds of reasons why that's an unhelpful way of thinking about things, both from an employer perspective, but also from a university perspective as well. Because particularly at this moment in time, I think there is a great need for context and for empathy around the experience that the graduating class of this year are going to have. So it's our least worst work experienced graduating class. They had internships and placements significantly more impacted than graduates' vacancies during the pandemic period. So had much less opportunity to have those good quality experiences, which would help them understand more and minimize and shorten that gap between education and employment by understanding more about it and how the expectations are different. They also simultaneously have part-time jobs reduced as well. We've seen an absence really of those normal adulthood experiences, early adulthood experiences that we would all want to have. And if you can think of those people in your life who are in their, late teens, early 20s, who've missed out on festivals and traveling and going to clubs and societies and freshers weeks that were done on Zoom. Oh, painful to think about what has been lost for them. And as much hard work as universities did to try and replicate it, when you are sat at home in your parents' bedroom and your childhood bedroom, it has not been a comparable experience, certainly in terms of the society, broader kind of experiences, the value that going to university gave so many people in terms of just meeting people from different countries, from different backgrounds, from socializing, from learning from others. We've also got that whole kind of context where we've now got really visible sharing around job success, employment success, which adds in very much to that narrative about, I'm being rejected and everybody else seems to be successful at a time when we know we're seeing a real spike in youth mental health issues. So generally, I like to banish that cynicism anyway. I think it's easy for us just to say, well, this is what life is like as an adult. This is adulting. Welcome to it. Wait till you've got kids and a dog and a mortgage. It's easy to fall into that trap. I think here, empathy in all of our thinking around student experience and this transition, particularly key this year, and I suspect probably for the next 2 to 3 years, for us to really start to ground our employability and our employment experiences to people in a way which really resonates with the experience they've had and the support that they need. So those life shifts I've talked about, I think, yes, they are challenging, particularly if you've got all of them going on at the same time. But interestingly, I think they can often be much easier to make than the mindset shifts which are required in that shift from education into employment. And Mark alluded to a number of those this morning. And I've endeavoured to capture here some of those mindset shifts that are required. So that shift from driving for perfection, for 100%, for a first, for the best score. I can spend as long as I like on my assignment. I really want to get it as perfect and as wonderful as possible. And actually, in the world of work, I do not want, and neither do any of us, anybody wasting their time making something perfect when most of the time we know 80% will be perfectly acceptable. That's all we need in order to be able to deliver. And that last 20% will take you 10 times as long to get and will make very little difference to the output. There are exceptions to that, of course. Anybody who works in quality assurance and safety for airlines, for example, I do want them working to 100%. So back to generalizations. But generally, in most work environments, we're looking for that quest for efficiency, not perfection, not dilly-dallying, not wasting, not prevaricating over finding that one extra little bit of something that will make it just perfect. Moving from clear tasks and deadlines where everybody knows what's expected well in advance, and we know, the standards that we need to meet in order to get there. Things change all the time in the world of work, and that can be challenging and difficult to understand what and why and how. My experience going from one being about, my student experience and my learning to now being one where the employer it's actually about, what is this person delivering in terms of value for the money that I'm paying them? And am I getting a return on investment? And what does that look like? So it's less about their learning, their development, their experience as an individual, but more about my contribution and what I'm delivering. That flexing time we've already talked about, the shift in feedback can be a really big mindset shift in people. So actually I'm used to getting nice, regular, constructive, objective grades that I can see exactly what's expected against criteria, how I've done, and then I know I'm going to get feedback on that too. Yeah, you know what, seem to be doing fine. I'll let you know if there's a problem. That could be a very big and difficult, complex shift to make. Moving from friends and peers to colleagues in hierarchy. And I think linked to that is this point about diversity. So yes, universities are diverse places in many, many ways. And yet when we look at student life, they do often tend to spend time with those people who are from similar social backgrounds to them, who come from, have similar political beliefs to them, are often of a similar age to them, have similar outlooks in life, and they're often, you know, similar academic attainment as well. And then they move into the world of work where they might be working with people who are 20 or 30 years older than them, didn't go to university, voted UKIP or voted for Brexit, have very different political beliefs, and also happen to be very, very good at what they do in the workplace. And for a lot of students, that can be a very challenging mindset shift to make, from one which is about, you know, really embracing diversity in bubbles, and it is very broad diversity, I think, in most university senses, to full diversity in life, which is, you know, difference of opinion, different perspective, different values, different ages, all those kind of things. And then that clarity. So we've talked about the linear nature of education. Mark reflected on that this morning, and actually how the nature of work and careers is much less linear. It's much more irregular and often requires self-navigation as opposed to there being a path that's been set out for you. And I think those mindset shifts are useful and helpful. We've got a number of others, by the way. This is a slightly abridged version of the full mindset shifts. But I think those, help us to both understand and articulate and normalize those shifts to graduates and students as part of that shift from student life to employee life. And we're certainly seeing a lot of the development work that we do with employers focusing on how do we accelerate that shift towards efficiency, ambiguity, being able to balance multiple priorities, changing tasks, understanding it's about delivery, and being able to, you know, manage themselves and self-direct. A lot of our graduate development program work, particularly in fast-paced areas like tech, they're really focused on those critical skills, not soft skills, critical skills for graduate success. So final thing, very quick fire. How do I think we can actually support some of that transition? I think the first thing is reflection and affirmation. So enabling and creating spaces for students to reflect on their experiences so far, to reaffirm those experiences and let them know that they have already made a number of key transitions in life. They have already developed a number of coping strategies that have worked very well for them, giving them the space to both personally reflect and to affirm that they have many of the skills already in their locker, and how they can use those to help them make this next transition. Articulating and normalizing these shifts, particularly the mindset shifts. I think using this infographic is helpful for students to be able to understand the differing expectations, and it gives them the sense that they're not alone. So very often when we talk about that shift that's required from education into employment, when we're working with graduates who are new into an employment organization, you can see the relief on their face. Oh gosh, thank goodness it's not just me that's struggling with this. It's not just me that's struggling with the fact that I don't know whether or not I'm doing a good job. I feel like I'm not being perfect all of the time. And that's, you know, being reaffirmed that that's okay. Of course, you're not going to be perfect. You're brand new into the job. Nobody expects you to be. Oh, thank heaven. Is that true? Marvelous. You know, we're doing a lot of work around this and around ambiguity, around changing deadlines. How do they cope with that agility, that flexibility that's required in a different type of environment? So articulating them, sharing them, normalizing them, and creating space for peers to discuss and support one another, they're hugely helpful. Having that responsive, agile, always on development and development support and development methods is something, again, that we're seeing increasingly in the employer space, and I would say much more so in the employability space as well. So giving students and graduates the opportunity to kind of self-diagnose, self-reflect against some of those transitions. Where are they? And what can they do, therefore, to either tailor their own development, or for you, if you can get aggregate data on that, which you can create surveys, we have some as well around those models, those transitions. How can we respond to the needs that this cohort of people, if you're managing a cohort of graduates or students, or indeed as an individual, how can I tailor my development to really help me accelerate and close that gap from where I feel I am and where I feel I need to be? And we're seeing more and more of that always on kind of just in time Netflix style provision across the sector. We're also seeing a real change in focus for this particular year. So less and less about leading development, for example. We're not seeing great response rates from students. That it feels too exposing. It feels, I'm not ready for that. Confidence development programs, interestingly, we have had people attending in number, in volume, and I think it's just about that change in focus and nuance and wording, which is allowing students to engage with the thing which is feeling like a real issue for them at this moment in time and this year. Interestingly, confidence coming out again and again amongst employers, and lots of confidence just coming out from some prospects research as well. I'd highlight to you this programme, which is from within faculty and supported by the careers team at the University of Leeds. I think this is a great example of where parity is starting to be given to outduction as a process just as much as induction. Think about the amount of time, effort, logistics, money, people, energy and effort that goes into inducting students every single year, and compare that to the amount of time, money, energy, effort and focus that is put into helping our students leave well. It will be incomparable, absolutely nowhere near. And yet I would often argue from a legacy perspective, an alumni engagement perspective, a future employer engagement perspective, from a goodwill and a brand perspective, there is huge value investing in that outduction. And this particular piece of work that Leeds ran not only looked at careers and employability in terms of next step, but also looking at things like mental health and wellness, and also looking at academic next steps and what happens beyond graduation, etc. So I think, these more holistic approaches to looking at outduction beyond just thinking about careers and employability and partnership more broadly, hugely helpful. We've heard from Mark about the opportunity to think differently about our development rather than it being simply workshops or us running the typical kind of sessions, but looking instead at how we can experiment, experience, adventure, play and fail, much more of the graduate development stuff that we're seeing, particularly around things like being able to help students get to grips with the amount of uncertainty and volatility that's out there, the amount of times that things change throughout the day. Those failure labs that we saw running at Newcastle University, for example, I think are a great example. Giving students these opportunities to try, to learn, to fail, to grow, hugely important. Thinking about how we can embed that and bring that into what we do. And it is counterintuitive, often, of course, to our typical academic learning methodologies. Coaching and peer learning appears to be particularly key at this transition point. People feel very vulnerable, they feel exposed, they think they should be hiding some of these vulnerabilities and some of these things that they're struggling with, particularly in that transition into employment. So I need to present myself as perfect, whereas coaching and peer coaching in safe spaces really enables them to open up, A, again, to normalize that experience and articulate it, but B, to be able to support one another and know that this is something that they can learn from one another, share with one another, support one another through that process. And finally, just on the life stuff, back to the life stuff at the very beginning, I think if we can support more with the life stuff, it will actually really help with some of the mindset stuff, because it will relieve some of the cognitive load. And that could be looking at things like supporting with driving lessons. If you've got bursaries, if you've got any financial support around employability that students can apply for, can they use that to get driving licenses or driving lessons? That could be a hugely practical thing that can help people in terms of that transition into work. Can you extend your mental health support beyond graduation, particularly this year for this graduate cohort? Is there something you can do to support that? And or, as many people have done over the last couple of years, if you've got programs for underemployed or unemployed graduates, over the summer or into the autumn? Can you interweave and collaborate with your mental health and wellbeing colleagues in the institution to interweave support, counselling and coaching into those kinds of programs to really help, particularly the further away they get from graduation? We're seeing higher instances of students presenting with more mental health issues. And then finally, if you have bursaries, if you have grants, if you have money that's focused on WP students and employability for those students, can you very simply make that available to people to help them with things like paying for rent, paying for those big deposits, those relocations, all those new suits, all those other kind of things that students might need? These seem like very small things to us. They can be huge barriers to many students, particularly those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So to summarise around the transition from education to employment, I think for most students, it's always been tough. I think all of us can remember getting into our first job and thinking, gosh, is this what I'm doing? Is this what I did my degree for? Surely I'm capable of more. I'm made for more. You know, is this what my life is now? 20 days holiday a year? What's this going to be like? It was always, I think, tough for many of us for different reasons. It's tougher for some than others. I think particularly for this class of graduates who've had less work experience, the gap is bigger. And I would say many are arguing, particularly on the employer side, that they feel that gap is not only bigger than it was, but it's stretching as the world of work accelerates very, very quickly, and the world of education remains reasonably static, although we're seeing, you know, as we've heard this morning already, progress in a number of areas around learning methodologies. That gap feels to many employers as if it's getting bigger, and actually how can we close some of that? Normalizing and articulating this is a very normal experience. The transition can be tough, and these are the things that you may very well experience, and that's perfectly normal, and creating a safe space around that, and nuance and flex for this particular moment in time, and I think for the next 2 to 3 years to come. How can we really respond to the needs of this graduating class and the specific needs that they're going to have in that transition from education into employment? That's everything from me. So I will hand back over to you now, Claire, and ask if we have any questions.
Thank you for that, Rebecca. That was fascinating. I really love the idea of play and that shift between life changes and mindset changes. I think it's really interesting. We do have 3 questions and we've got 3 minutes, so we're going to do it in a quick fire method. So first question is from Helen. The confidence development program, has it attracted a diverse range of students?
Yep, absolutely. So we've run it in a number of different institutions, and we've had a very diverse range of students from all kinds of ethnicities, and interestingly from all kinds of ages as well. So yes, been very, very diverse. It seems to be speaking, I think, just in terms of that slight shift in language, seems to be speaking to students and their needs at this moment in time.
Excellent. And the other 2 questions are focused specifically on outduction. So one question is focused from Emma Moore on struggling to get students to engage with outduction. Any tips on content, timing, comms to kind of drive engagement?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things that made that concept and that project a particular success at Leeds was it was driven by faculty. It was driven by academic, it was in curriculum, it was focused towards the end of their degree as well, but it was integrated by multiple services, but led by the academics in faculty. So they were really able to make it feel very much like a celebratory event, as part, a culmination as part of their whole degree experience with their graduating class, as opposed to, I think, you know, if you're trying to drive an outduction experience at either at an institutional level or from a careers and employability perspective, it's much more difficult to try and engage the students, because it doesn't feel like a natural next step as part of my student experience and student journey.
It needs to feel like it's part of the community they're already in, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly that.
And the final question is focused more on the employer side of the outduction piece. So what have you seen? Because obviously there's a huge amount there around what universities can do in relation to outduction, but what have you seen employers doing in sort of the induction into that employment world?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a huge amount of stuff going on the employer side, and I think that's where it's informed this session, really. There's been a significant recognition amongst employers that they need to do more this year. They have already made quite significant changes, many of them in their recruitment processes, in order to make them more accessible, to remove some of those barriers to entry and expectations around prior work experience, which makes a big difference. And then we're seeing much more significant activity around, for example, supporting coaching for underrepresented groups before they enter into the organisation, much more around the onboarding experience, kind of anytime, all time, always on type development resources prior to them accessing the organisation, and then a significant investment in extended graduate induction, looking at giving them more time to really understand and develop that commercial awareness and make connections within organisations. So we're seeing some big changes, I think, this year, and we did last year, of course, but this year, I think, you know, we're feeling the worst of the 3 years that have hit any graduating class. Next year's graduating class, I think, hopefully it'll be a little bit easier. The year before, I think it was a little bit easier. This is the class that's had it the hardest. And so we're definitely seeing a whole raft of different things that our employers are doing there.
Yeah, and hopefully lots of good practice will come from that will
Yes.
maintain even as the world kind of hopefully returns to normal, right? Thank you, Rebecca, again.